The vanishing village of Lake Anjikuni. An entire community disappears overnight. The discovery. It was the winter of 1930 in the remote wilderness of northern Canada. Snow stretched endlessly, and the icy wind carried the sound of silence across the vast land. Lake Anjikuni lay frozen under a thick sheet of ice, surrounded by dark forests and distant mountains. The only signs of life in this lonely part of the Northwest Territories were the small Inuit villages that had existed there for generations. One of these villages sat along the lake's shore, a close-knit community where families lived in wooden cabins and skin tents, surviving by hunting, fishing, and sharing what they had. But in late November of that year, something strange happened, something so unsettling that it would later be told as one of the greatest mysteries in Canadian history. It began when a fur trapper named Joe LaBelle, who was familiar with the area and had visited the village many times, arrived at Lake Anjikuni after a long journey through the snow. He expected to be greeted with smiles, warm food, and the smell of smoke from cooking fires. But as he approached, something felt wrong. The village was silent, too silent. There were no barking dogs, no children laughing, no voices at all. The snow on the ground was untouched, except for Joe's own trail. He walked among the homes and found doors hanging open, food sitting on tables, and clothes left behind as if the people had simply stood up and walked away in the middle of their lives. Fish hung in the smokehouses, tools lay where they had been dropped, and rifles rested against walls. It was as if time had stopped. Even more disturbing, Joe saw no footprints leaving the village, only the tracks of people going about the daily business before they vanished. Inside one cabin, a pot of stew sat on the fire, frozen solid, showing that it had been left hours or perhaps days earlier without anyone returning. Joe's unease grew with each step. In the dog kennels, he found sled dogs still tied up, but they were dead, starved to death despite there being food in the homes. It was as though every living person had simply ceased to exist at the same moment, without taking a single thing with them. Confused and frightened, Joe hurried away from the silent settlement to find help. When he reached the nearest Royal Canadian Mounted Police station, he told them about the deserted village. The Mounties gathered a team and traveled to Lake Anjikuni to investigate, braving the biting cold and deep snow. When they arrived, they confirmed everything Joe had described, and then found something even stranger. The village's burial ground had been disturbed. Several graves were open, and the bodies were gone. There were no signs of animals digging them up, and the ground was frozen too hard for any casual intruder to have done it. This was not just an abandonment, it was something far more mysterious. As the Mounties stood in the empty village, surrounded by untouched snow and eerie silence, they knew they were looking at one of the strangest disappearances in history. But who, or what, had taken an entire community without leaving a single trace? And why had they taken the dead as well as the living? These questions would haunt every investigator who heard about the vanishing village of Lake Anjikuni. The investigation begins. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, known for their toughness and skill in dealing with the dangers of the North, began their investigation with a mix of determination and unease. This was not just another case of a missing hunter or a family moving away. This was an entire community, men, women, and children, gone without a trace. The first thing the Mounties noticed was the unnatural stillness. Normally, in the North, even if people left, nature would begin to reclaim the land quickly, snow drifting over paths, wolves sniffing around, birds picking at scraps. But here, nothing had disturbed the village since the people vanished. The snow was undisturbed except for the tracks of Joe LaBelle and now the police. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken furniture, no blood, no damage to the homes. It was as if the villagers had been called away suddenly and silently. The Mounties checked every cabin, noting that supplies were plentiful. There was no reason for the villagers to leave in the middle of winter. They had enough food stored to last the season, warm clothing for the cold, and fuel for their fires. Their sleds and canoes were still there, untouched. In the dog kennels, the dead sled dogs were found lying in the snow, still tied to their posts, a tragic sight that made even the hardened policemen shudder. The dogs had not been eaten by wild animals, which was unusual, they were just frozen in place, as though no animal dared come near. The police then turned their attention to the graveyard. This was where the mystery deepened. Several graves had been opened, but the earth was frozen hard as stone. Digging would have taken enormous effort in such conditions, yet there were no signs of tools, and the edges of the graves were clean, as if they had been melted open. Stranger still, there were no footprints around the disturbed graves, no sign that a living person had been there recently. The Mounties questioned other trappers and nearby Inuit communities. Some said they had not seen the missing villages for weeks. Others whispered about strange lights in the sky over Lake Anjikuni on the night they disappeared. One hunter spoke of hearing a loud humming sound that came from above, followed by a sudden silence that made the forest feel empty, in a way he could not explain. As the police gathered these accounts, a chilling possibility began to take shape: something unnatural may have taken the villages. But was it something from the land, the sky, or perhaps even something from beneath the frozen lake? The Mounties kept their theories to themselves, knowing that without evidence, such talk would sound like wild superstition. Yet deep inside, each of them felt that they were facing a mystery that might never be solved. As the investigation continued, more strange details emerged. The fishing holes in the ice were still open, as if the people had been fishing right before they vanished. Nets lay in the water, frozen in place, with fish caught inside. Inside one cabin, a diary was found, its last entry written in hurried handwriting. It mentioned something in the sky, and the elders telling us to stay indoors. The entry ended mid-sentence, as if the writer had been interrupted. That was the last written word left by the people of Lake Anjikuni. The Mounties knew they were running out of time. In the frozen north, clues vanish quickly under snow and ice. If they didn't find answers soon, this mystery would be swallowed forever by the cold. And so they made a choice: they would stay in the village for several nights, watching, waiting, hoping that whatever had happened might leave behind some sign of its return. They didn't yet realize that their nights at Lake Anjikuni would only deepen the mystery and leave them with more questions than answers. Nights in the empty village. The Mounties set up camp in the largest cabin in the village, its walls thick with layers of animal hides and logs. They lit a fire in the stone hearth, and though the flames gave warmth, they could not melt the chill that seemed to hang in the air. Outside, the northern wind whispered through the empty streets, brushing against the wooden frames of silent houses. The sound was unsettling, like voices too faint to understand. The first night passed quietly. The men took turns keeping watch, their rifles close at hand. Every few hours they would walk through the village with lanterns, peering into shadows and scanning the frozen lake. Nothing stirred except the flicker of their own lights. But as dawn approached, strange things began to happen. Corporal Jensen, who had been posted near the graveyard, reported seeing faint blue lights hovering above the lake. They pulsed gently, like a heartbeat, and then faded into the darkness. At first, the others thought he might have been seeing reflections from the stars, but Jensen swore on his life they were not stars. On the second night, the wind grew stronger, carrying with it an odd, low humming sound. It was not like the whine of the wind through the trees, it was deeper, almost mechanical, and it seemed to come from all directions at once. The men went outside to listen, but whenever they tried to locate the source, it would fade away, leaving only silence behind. Later that night, Sergeant McLeod, the leader of the group, swore he saw movement near one of the fishing holes in the ice. He approached slowly, his boots crunching softly in the snow. But when he reached the hole, he found nothing, only a perfectly circular opening in the ice, its edges smooth as glass, as if it had been cut with precision. The fishing net inside was gone, and the water below rippled faintly, though no wind touched its surface. On the third night, things grew even stranger. Private Ross, while making his patrol, thought he heard voices coming from the direction of the forest. At first they were faint, but then they grew louder, overlapping whispers that seemed to come from many people speaking at once. He followed the sound for several steps before he realized his own footprints were the only ones in the snow. The voices stopped abruptly, and the forest fell silent. That same night, the fire in their cabin suddenly went out, not slowly, but all at once, as if a sudden rush of air had stolen its life. In the dim glow of their lanterns, they saw frost forming rapidly along the inside walls, spreading like white fingers reaching toward them. The air grew so cold that they could see their breath in thick clouds. And then came the most disturbing event yet. Just before dawn, all of the men awoke to a deep vibration in the floor beneath them. It was not an earthquake, the ground did not shake violently. Instead, it was a steady, rhythmic pulsing, as though something huge was moving far below the earth, in time with the strange humming they had heard before. They stepped outside and saw the frozen surface of Lake Anjikuni glowing faintly beneath the ice. It was not the reflection of the moon or the northern lights. The glow came from beneath, and it was moving, slowly drifting from one end of the lake to the other. The Mounties stood in silence, watching, until the glow sank deeper and vanished. By morning, they all agreed on one thing: they were witnessing something far beyond their understanding. The disappearance of the villagers might not have been a simple crime, or even a tragedy caused by nature. There was a feeling, one none of them dared to speak aloud, that something was still here, watching them, and that the same fate might one day claim them too. The land that wouldn't let them go. By the time the sun rose on the fourth day, the Mounties had made up their minds: they would leave. The strange lights, the humming, and the unnatural cold were signs that something beyond their training was happening here. They were police officers, not scientists or priests. Whatever had taken the villagers was not something they could catch in handcuffs. They packed quickly, loading their sleds with gear, weapons, and the few samples they had collected: frozen food, bits of cloth, and pieces of the smooth ice from the fishing hole. The dogs, however, were restless. They whined and pulled against their harnesses, ears flattened, eyes darting toward the forest. Sergeant McLeod ordered them into position, and finally, with effort, the team began to move across the snow. The lake lay behind them, silent and pale in the morning light. But they had gone no more than half a mile when Private Ross shouted for them to stop. The trail ahead, one they had taken only days before, was gone. In its place was a wall of snow and ice, almost like a ridge, stretching as far as they could see in both directions. McLeod didn't believe it at first. He thought they had taken a wrong turn, so they tried another route. But each path led to the same thing: either a frozen barrier or dense forest that had not been there before. The land itself seemed to have shifted. As they scouted for a way out, the wind began to rise again, carrying with it that same deep humming they had heard at night. The sound was louder now, vibrating in their chests, making their teeth ache. It was impossible to tell where it came from. It seemed to come from everywhere. Private Jensen, who had been at the rear, suddenly shouted. When the others ran to him, they found the trail they had left behind was gone. Their sled tracks, their boot prints, everything, had been wiped clean as though no one had passed that way. The snow was untouched, pure, and smooth. Panic began to creep in. These were experienced men, used to harsh winters and dangerous terrain, but this was different. The land was behaving like it was alive, and it was closing in on them. That night, they decided to make camp again, too exhausted to keep searching for a way out. The fire they lit seemed weaker than before, the flames bending and twisting as though resisting the cold. Around midnight, the dogs began to bark furiously, their eyes fixed on the tree line. When the men looked, they saw shadows moving between the trees. At first, they thought it might be wolves, but the shapes were wrong: too tall, too thin, and they moved in complete silence. As the shadows drew closer, the air grew heavy, and the men felt pressure in their ears, like the moments before a thunderstorm. Then, just as quickly as they appeared, the figures melted back into the forest, swallowed by the darkness. The Mounties did not sleep for the rest of the night. In the morning, they found something that made their blood run cold: new graves in the cemetery. The mounds were fresh, the snow on top still loose. But the most disturbing part was that the names carved into the wooden markers were their own. Every man in the group had a grave waiting for him. MacLeod knew then that the lake was not just a place of mystery, it was a trap. And whatever force had taken the villages was not finished yet. The final night, the graves with the names still haunted the Mounties as night fell. None of them spoke much, each lost in his own fear, but their eyes were constantly scanning the shadows. Sergeant MacLeod kept his rifle close and ordered the others to stay near the fire. The dogs were restless again, pulling at their chains, but they no longer barked. Instead, they stared at the darkness beyond the light, ears twitching at sounds the men could not hear. The humming returned, deeper and more forceful, rattling the metal pots and making the ground tremble. Then, from across the lake, a light began to rise, not like the moon, but like a column of pale blue fire. It shimmered and danced, stretching high into the clouds, casting the snow in ghostly colors. Private Jensen whispered that it looked like the northern lights, but wrong, too focused, too alive. The humming grew louder until it seemed the men's bones would crack. And then, out of the forest, they came. Figures, tall, thin, their limbs impossibly long. Their faces, or what should have been faces, were smooth and featureless, yet somehow the Mounties felt those beings were staring straight into their minds. The figures moved silently over the snow, not sinking into it, not leaving any mark. They circled the camp slowly, like wolves testing prey. MacLeod shouted for the men to hold the ground, but his voice was swallowed by the humming. One of the figures stopped beside the fresh graves and placed a long, pale hand on each wooden marker. The wood blackened instantly, curling and crumbling into ash. Another figure approached the sled dogs. The animals, usually fierce and loyal, lowered themselves to the ground, whining like frightened pups. The air grew heavier, harder to breathe. Private Ross suddenly dropped his rifle and clutched his chest. The others tried to reach him, but their bodies felt sluggish, as though the cold itself was inside their muscles. The blue light from the lake intensified until it was blinding. The figures turned toward it, and without a sound, they began to glide in its direction. One by one, the Mounties felt themselves being pulled forward, not physically dragged, but compelled, as if something in their minds was no longer their own. MacLeod fought against it, his boots digging into the snow, but the pull was relentless. He looked around, his men's faces were blank, their eyes wide and unfocused. They walked willingly toward the blue fire, their bodies stiff, their steps perfectly in sync. Even the dogs followed. When MacLeod reached the shore, he saw that the lake was no longer frozen. The ice had melted in a perfect circle, and in the water, the blue fire burned from somewhere deep below. The humming was now inside his skull, shaking his thoughts apart. The figures entered the water without hesitation, vanishing beneath the glowing surface. One by one, his men followed. Ross, Jensen, Harris, each stepped into the lake and sank without a ripple. The dogs went next, silent and obedient. MacLeod was the last. The pull was unbearable now, his mind screamed to resist, but his body moved forward. The freezing water closed around him, and for a brief moment, he felt weightless, suspended in a void of light. Shapes moved all around him, whispering in a language he couldn't understand. And then, nothing. Weeks later, a rescue party arrived, following the Mounties' original trail. They found the village still empty, the graves untouched, no new mounds, no signs of life. But near the lake's shore, they found the Mounties' sleds, their supplies neatly stacked, their rifles leaning against the wood. The dogs were gone. The snow was smooth and unbroken, as though no one had been there for years. To this day, no trace of Sergeant MacLeod or his men has ever been found. And those who live near Lake Anjikuni say that on some nights, when the sky glows pale blue, you can hear a low humming carried on the wind, and see figures moving just beyond the treeline, waiting for someone else to join them.